Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Morton Blackwell, president of the Leadership Institute. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this, our February Wednesday Wake-Up Club breakfast. We live in interesting times. Last night, after literally more than 40 years living in this area, I actually attended the State of the Union address. A Congresswoman, Jean Schmidt, who had recently been elected, hired a former intern of mine, and Congressman Schmidt's office called yesterday and asked if I would like to be her guest. So I went to see it. She being probably one of the most junior members, her seat was behind the lectern, and the gallery is so arranged that one cannot see the lectern from this particular section. But I did, but I got there early, and I saw all the members of the Congress and the dignitaries come in, and the president come in, and it was very interesting. There was a great animal roar of satisfaction from the Republican side when Justice Alito walked in. One of the more exciting moments. And it's a testament to the correct perception of the importance of the Supreme Court that not only have the last two appointments both been suggested on both sides as absolutely critical to the future direction of the court, and particularly the Alito nomination. It's the swing vote. I'm here this morning to make a prediction to you. When the next vacancy occurs, it will also be described as the swing vote. The Leadership Institute has been having extraordinary success. Last year, we broke the 2004 record for enrollment. 2004, we enrolled 3,802 students. Last year, we enrolled 6,017 students, a 58% increase. In September of 2004, we had 216 active independent conservative student groups that our campus leadership program field staff had organized. In the end of December last year, we had 693, a 320% increase since September of 2004. Last year, our graduates organized 44 new conservative campus publications, which is exactly twice the previous record number of 22. We had a remarkably successful year last year, and good things financially happened as well. Sadly, two of our longtime donors died, but they had decided to, in their estate plans, each of them leave us multi-million-dollar legacies. And we got in less than half of the larger of those two legacies came in on December 30th. And knowing that it was likely to come, we had made arrangements, and we were able on that day to pay off the mortgage on this building. And we were able to establish a reserve fund, which we never had before, of $2.5 million, which is 27% of our $9.4 million budget for this year. And on top of everything else, on September 15th, of last year, Helen and I, for the first time, became grandparents. So last year was really a roaring year for me and my family and the Leadership Institute. Thus far this year, we have trained 454 students in 15 schools, and we've placed 6 job seekers through our employment placement program. And you have before you on the tables our preliminary 2006 school schedule. Many other schools will be scheduled during the course of the year. Please take a moment to review those sheets and consider attending one of these schools or sending friends to any of our programs. And keep in mind that the schedule does grow dramatically during the course of the year, and keep in touch with us if a particular type of school is of interest to you. We'll let you know as additional schools of that nature are scheduled. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Connie Marshner, who will offer an invocation and pledge of allegiance. Connie is Senior Development Officer here at the Institute, and last week Connie directed the Leadership Institute's first ever International Leadership Training Seminar. This was conceptually Connie's. Although she's a development officer, she has long experience in political education and training, and she was in charge of the recruitment and the conduct of the school. The school attracted 59 students from 21 countries. A very fine program. Prior to coming here at the Institute, Connie was Executive Vice President of Paul Weyrich's Free Congress Foundation. She's a longtime activist on family and social issues. She's the author of several books and editor of the Adoption Fact Book number 3. Connie?
Thank you, Morton. I'm one of those old-fashioned people who likes to stand for prayer, and then please remain standing for the pledge. Heavenly Father, you are the consoler, you are the Spirit of truth, you are present in all places, you fill all things, you are the treasury of blessings, you are the giver of life. Come and dwell in us, cleanse us from our sins, save our souls, for you are a gracious God and you love mankind. And we ask you, Lord, to bless us, bless our families, bless those who are dear to us, bless our work, bless our friends, bless our enemies, and bless our nation, and bless all the people who love you and worship you and seek to honor you. Amen. Please join me for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated.
Thank you very much, Connie. Good job, as always, in everything that you do. Now I will present to you Christian Roby. He'll give us an update on activities of his position of alumni and organizational relations. Christian has worked for various conservative and free market think tanks, including Cato, Americans for Tax Reform, the Foundation for Economic Education, and Citizens for a Sound Economy. But let me guess, Christian, have you worked here longer than any one of those other groups? Great. That's right. He left us once, but he came back, and he's, I think, now comfortable here, and we're comfortable with him. He is currently the Director of Alumni and Organizational Relations here at the Leadership Institute. He graduated from Virginia Tech with a degree in philosophy in 1998. Is there a Hokie in the hall? And he did graduate work for 2 years at George Mason University School of Law. He's a native of Virginia and currently resides in Alexandria. Christian?
Thank you very much, Morton. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you. If Sarah is here, thanks for letting me speak this morning about our programs. Well, LI has accomplished a lot over the past year. Morton already went into some of the incredible things that we did and some of the record-breaking achievements that we made. So what I want to do is I want to talk about just a couple of small examples, 3 small examples of some of the things that we're doing that'll just give you a tiny glimpse into the progress that we're making. And I'll start with another international victory. As you may know, one of the schools that we do is our grassroots activism school, and this travels all across the country. We hold it in the United States, but one of the recent attendees was Lori Hahn, and I don't know if you've been following Canadian politics, but Lori Hahn actually won the election for Deputy Prime Minister of Canada against Anne McClellan. So I think that this is a very interesting development because people are starting to come all over the world to, without our solicitation, they're starting to come to our programs to learn how to win. Morton also spoke about our employment placement service. We have already had 6 placements, but I think one of the interesting things about what we've done this year with employment placement is to have the White House Office of Personnel sign up on our webpage. Now, again, this is not something that we actively go out and solicit people for. So to have the White House Office of Personnel sign up on the webpage, I think, is another great indication of the work that we've been doing. And finally, my third example, and I am going to talk just a little bit about my position, but I can't pass the morning out without talking about this. Recently at DePaul, which as you might know is the largest Catholic university in America, one of our student groups, it's not actually one of the ones that we helped get going, the Conservative Alliance held an affirmative action bake sale. Now, I don't know if you all are familiar with this, but the idea is that it's supposed to mirror, these bake sales mirror affirmative action policies in the campuses. So, for example, a cupcake for a white student might be more expensive than one for an Asian student, and on down the line. Well, so picture these kids, doing this affirmative action bake sale, and this troop, no kidding, of administration officials comes up, and they said, we're shutting you down. And when the student that was running it, Michael O'Shea, asked, well, why? Why are you shutting us down? They said something to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing here, well, because we're administration officials and we're telling you to. That's why. So, yeah, so keep in mind that the Democratic student organization was holding another event right close to them. Now, it just so happens that Michael O'Shea is the editor of the conservative student newspaper, the Lincoln Park Statesman. And I don't know about you, but it doesn't seem like just a coincidence to me. The reason I bring this back is because unbeknownst to them, the university has kind of stumbled themselves into a trap. And what we do is we teach students how to fight back. We publish this pamphlet right here. It's called Fight Back. And it's kind of a judo manual for campus activism. So these students are going to use this situation now to turn this situation into their favor. So finally, we have a new program that we've started up recently, as Morton spoke about, that I am really excited about heading up, and it's our organization, it's our Department of Organization and Alumni Relations. And the idea here is that we have all these great graduates. We are just now, I think, as one of our speakers has said recently, we've just now started, we're at the beginning, really, of our programs. We've been around for 25 years, but we have so much more to do, and with this department we're going to be able to reach out and really work with our alumni and graduate relations. So I would be very happy to speak with any of you all about any of our programs, and of course this new one. But now I think I'll turn the program back over to Morton. So thank you for your time and attention.
years with 3 congressmen, and not just any congressman. He was chief of staff to Bob Michael, he was chief of staff to Jack Kemp, and he was chief of staff to Congressman Don Ritter. And those jobs were served between a number of other important positions. He had an appointment from President Gerald Ford as Congressional Liaison Officer at the Department of Transportation, and he served as Washington representative for Jamaican Prime Minister Edward Seaga during President Reagan's successful effort to enact the Caribbean Basin Initiative. Since 1998, as the director of the Leadership Institute's Employment Placement Service, Jim has helped hundreds of conservatives find jobs on the Hill and in the administration and with numerous public policy organizations. Jim retired from Capitol Hill, and having served long enough in government to have a well-deserved retirement, and he came to see me sometime after that formal retirement and said he really didn't like doing nothing. And was there any place that I knew where he might go to work? And at that moment we had a vacancy in to be head of our employment placement service. And I thought about it, and I realized that in all these jobs he had had an immense experience with virtually every area of the public policy process, and had been doing an awful lot of hiring, and I presume some firing over time. And I said, well, we have this position. How about that? And so now, while I'm sure he deserves every penny of the government retirement that he has, it's now 8 years, he's been working with us and doing a fine job. And so I'm proud to present him to you, and he will introduce our truly outstanding and famous speaker. Jim?
Thank you, Morton, and good morning. On January 6, 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt spoke to the 77th Congress and said, quote, "I address you, the members of this new Congress, at a moment unprecedented in the history of the Union." The President continued, "I use the word unprecedented because at no previous time has American security been as seriously threatened from without as it is today." This was the famous speech of 4 freedoms that was subsequently illustrated by Norman Blackwell on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. Now, 65 years later, President Bush last night and current book reviews of our speaker's new bestseller emphasize the issue has not changed. From one book review, I quote, how liberalism denigrated from the war-winning policies of FDR to an ideology of Western suicide, Tony Blankley asks the hard questions and gives the straight answers that our country needs to hear. From another commentator, quote, Tony Blankley's The West's Last Chance is a wake-up call for the West to recognize the dangers from radical Islam. In addition to these plaudits, please note in your program our speaker served in the Reagan administration as a senior policy analyst, was for 7 years the press secretary to Speaker Newt Gingrich, is the editorial page editor of the Washington Times, a regular with the McLaughlin Group, and has been featured with many more programs and publications that are outlined in your program. Please welcome Tony Blankley.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being invited to speak here this morning. You know, I started in conservative political activism in 1964 in Southern California. I was a youth coordinator in the Goldwater campaign in the primary against Rockefeller. And I can't tell you how much more effective we could have been if we'd had the kind of training that's available here. We were inventing it. There was no movement to speak of. We had Human Events and National Review, and that was it. It was the high point of liberalism. I happen to remember I was in junior high debating capital punishment, and 65% of the public was against capital punishment in 1964. 1965 was probably the high point of American liberalism, with the passage of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and Medicare and Civil Rights Act, some of which are excellent legislation, but I don't want to denigrate every piece of it, although the war on poverty failed terribly in that it lost and poverty increased, but in its targeted audience. But we didn't know how to go about the business of trying to organize and rally a country to principles that we were only grappling to fully understand ourselves. And in the now, 40 years? I hate to think it's 42 years now, I guess. The conservative movement has come an extraordinarily long way, as is obvious. And part of the reason is because we have young people coming along who are learning the experiences that their elders gained the hard way. And Morton's been out in the field, I think, since he was probably younger than I was then, working on this. And it's so important to keep that process going, because it's very easy to become complacent and to forget the methods for fighting for what you believe in. And you can see in this world that whether it's a nation or a movement, you let down your guard for a moment, and the rest of the world is going to clobber you. And conservatism is running reasonably high right now, but you only have to watch the Soros movement and many others to know that they're waiting for their day, and they're impatient. And from their point of view, I don't blame them. They want to study and figure out how to do to conservatism what we managed to do to liberalism over the last 40 years, and they will if we don't remain effective. So I'm so honored to be here to speak to a group that does so much to continue the process of training people to fight the good political fight. I've been out talking about politics now for quite a while, and back in the 90s, you could sort of have a set-piece speech, and other than change the odd word or two, it was good for like 6 months or 10 months without any change. You sort of pulled it out of your drawer, you got on an airplane, you flew somewhere and delivered the same speech. And today, you don't even have, you can't even rely on the morning paper to be the current state of the news, because things happen after the morning paper. I remember last week, some of you may remember the headlines in all the newspapers of the world, including my own, the Washington Times, was that Fatah beat Hamas in the Palestinians, and that was based on the vaunted exit polls which had elected President Kerry some months before that. I'll be proud to say, by the way, that my editorial, which was also written the day before, fudged it more. We said Hamas is going to have an increasingly large role. I wasn't quite convinced that they were going to lose. I wasn't convinced they were going to win. So we fudged it more than the headlines. But whether it was the New York Times or the Washington Post or any of the papers, they simply said, Fatah won. So it's very tricky to talk about politics without being very current. I assume a lot of you listened to the State of the Union last night, and then I stayed up after that to write my column I actually put it off a day for Thursday because it was too late for my deadline by then for today's paper. And I tend to try to be very honest in my political commentary, both on TV and in person, because I don't think there's any point in another approach. And I was not entirely satisfied with the speech last night, and I'll point out a few areas that concern me. I'm capable of supporting a good man who's leading a good team and still politely criticize and suggest changes at the same time. And I think politics is a team sport, and nobody accomplishes anything in politics alone. Not even dictators. Even dictators need to have a team and need to somehow at least have a non-restive public. And in a democracy in particular, you need to be part of a big team to get anything done. And you have to figure out how do you work with that team, try to change tactics and sometimes strategies while still being a player of the team. And I've sort of spent a fair part of my political life politely criticizing some of my elders, now some of my juniors, I guess, as time passes on. And so I'll make a few comments on it. I wanted to start out, and I wasn't going to just talk about my book because there's so much news going on. I'll be glad to talk about it a little bit, and I'm going to leave a lot of time for Q&A. We can talk about whatever you want. Obviously, I wrote my book because after September 11th, I didn't think there was a more important topic on the planet than figuring out what our national security required us to do. And I spent the starting about September 13th calling people I knew from in the intelligence community from my days in the White House and with Newt to find out what was going on. And I'll just say that I was an alarmist. I was shocked at what had happened. We live in Great Falls, Virginia, about 6 miles from Blankley, Virginia. And I was standing out in our horse field that morning, and I just got a call from a friend on the National Security Council who told me that Barbara Olson, who was a close friend and a neighbor, had just been in the plane that went into the Pentagon. She and I, in fact, shared a physical trainer together. It had worked better for Barbara than it had for me. God bless her. And I was standing in the horse field and aimlessly thinking, and one of the thoughts that crossed my mind was I was wondering which way the wind blows. Am I downwind or upwind of Langley? CIA headquarters struck me as a possible target. And it was that physicalness of thought. This was not Washington policy think. This wasn't a theoretical proposition and where is my ideology take me on. This was sniffing the wind to figure out whether the land that my horses are on, the land that my children play in, was going to be safe to play in. And I brought that mentality to thinking about the war on terror, which I think should better be called the war against radical Islam, to the thinking about and researching and writing my book. And I dropped ideology and I dropped any preconceptions about what I think ought to be done and just try to look at the facts square on. And I've written the book on that basis, and I think it's a pretty good read, and I'd be glad to talk about it as you wish during the Q&A period. I wanted to start off this morning with sort of an observation that probably fairly benign or even prosaic, but I think it's worth observing because I think it relates a little bit to where Bush is today. I find that in life in general, and politics in particular, it's really important not to let the scope of your vision and the pace of your tactics be defined by your environment, but to define it for yourself. As I say, it's a prosaic proposition. Go to the beat of a different drummer, however you want to say it. But the great danger in politics is you get sucked into the environment you're functioning in and end up accomplishing less because the political system is there. And I sense, and I'm going to give you one example from the speech last night. It was a good speech. I thought the President delivered it well. Didn't disagree with too much of anything he said. I would like to have heard a little bit more vigor on the border, but we'll put that aside. But I thought one area that I'm concerned about, I've been writing a lot about, is Iran and the potential of getting nuclear weapons in Iran. And I thought that he was pulling in his horns a little bit. I had advised publicly and privately that the President make a statement something to the effect of Iran will not go nuclear on my watch. We did not get that statement last night. And what we got from the President was two statements. One, the Iranian government is defying the world with its nuclear ambitions, and the nations of the world must not permit the Iranian regime to gain nuclear weapons. America will continue to rally the world to confront these threats. We will continue to rally the world to confront these threats. And then he said to the Iranian people, America respects you, we respect your country, we respect your right to choose your own future and win your own freedom, and we hope to be your friend. Now, I didn't have the text from last year's State of the Union address, but I've written a number of editorials on it over the last year, favorably, and paraphrasing, but pretty closely paraphrasing from memory, in the speech last year on the same topics, he said Iran will not develop a nuclear capacity. So I think that's a little bit of backsliding from we will lead the country in rallying to continue to confront these threats as opposed to assure that they don't happen. It was a flat statement, it wasn't going to happen. Now we're simply rallying the country to confront the danger. And then regarding the Iranian people, last time he said, if you stand for freedom, we will stand with you, or was very close to that, which was largely interpreted as virtually encouraging the Iranian people to revolt. And that was how it was interpreted both by the Iranian regime last year and by media around the world. This time, he's simply saying, we respect your right to choose your own leaders, and we hope you'll be free, and we look forward to being your friends. That seemed to be pulling back a little bit. Now, I happen to think that this is likely to be the year when we either do or don't confront Iran on the nuclear issue. And my concern is that we won't, and that we're going to let Iranian nuclear capacity become a fait accompli and live with that consequence. Now, I understand that there is a huge price to pay for action as well as for inaction, because action would require probably more than sanctions. Sanctions don't work very often against determined countries. One of the few times economic sanctions have actually worked to change a regime would have been South Africa. It took a long time, and it included an active majority of the population in violent rebellion to them, combined with a world sanction, and that took many years. I don't think we have many years. We have some shorter period of time on Iran. I believe that our government is going to try to move towards some kind of economic sanctions and restraint on importing needed products into Iran, and I fear that won't work. If we took action against them, obviously we have two huge downsides. One, the 4 million barrels a day of Iranian oil would probably come off the market for some period of time. There's a risk that they might be able to block the Straits of Hormuz, and the 18 million barrels of oil a day that come through the Straits could be lost for some period of time, which would be a staggering blow to the world economy. And the Iranians have the capacity to project terrorism around the world, probably, possibly including in the United States. So they have. It's not a risk-free decision either way. There's a high price to pay for action, and there's a high price to pay for inaction. And I just suspect that we're on a slope to paying the high price of inaction rather than the high price of action. But maybe I'm misinterpreting the speech, or maybe the President will exert his resolve. But this comes when people say, well, what difference does it make whether the President's at 38% or 52% job approval? You begin to see in little ways the way a president, and I have tremendous admiration. I think Bush is one of the gutsiest presidents we've ever had. I think that the courage that he showed, the decision to go to war in Afghanistan and Iraq, I'm not sure there's another person who could have been elected president in the last couple of cycles who had shown that courage and that conviction. And I know him well enough. Some of you may know him, I'm sure know him better than I do. He believes he's got a duty to do his job, and his job is to protect the country, and he's going to do what it takes. And I've worked and I tremendously admire him for that. But I've worked in a White House, worked in Reagan's White House for 6 years, and worked for another great president, I think. And notwithstanding that kind of personal character that a president might have, and this president has, and Ronald Reagan had, nonetheless, the grinding down process of politics, the advice you get from your friends and your counselors and your advisors, the deductions that they reach about what's doable and what's not doable, about the political price you're going to pay if you take a stand here versus there, it pressures down on a president and makes it harder and harder to stand alone, sometimes against his own team. I wasn't in the room, but I'm told one time that when Jim Baker suggested to Ronald Reagan when he was president that maybe raising taxes would be a good idea, Reagan, in one of his few displays of anger, threw his glasses across the room and said, "If you think that, why are you working for me?" And he had to essentially, and we did not raise taxes, and Jim Baker never proposed a tax increase again, during the Reagan administration at least. And, but it shows you that even a man as magnificent as Ronald Reagan could feel the pressure from his own closest advisors to do things that he judged not to be in the national interest. And I think that this has been last year has been an extremely tough year on the president, and his advisors are naturally trying to figure out how to help him survive. I was with Reagan when we had Iran-Contra, and Reagan was down to 37, 38% job approval by the early spring of '87. He had been at 65, 67% the previous fall before the Iran-Contra story broke, and we doggedly built back to 65% job approval by the time the president had retired. I did the first rough draft of a strategic memo on that at that time, and I picked a notional speech for July 4th of 1987 and wrote the outline of what we'd like it for the president to be able to say, and then sort of back-engineered a communication strategy to try to figure out what do we need to have accomplished to make that kind of a set of remarks plausible for a president to deliver. Now, I did that initially just on my own because we were dead in the water in the Reagan White House. The old man had gone upstairs and was going to come back down when everybody had fixed things up some, and we were going through a difficult period with the Chief of Staff, Donald Regan, and we were kind of wandering around with our head cut off, so I just sat down and did that and sort of tossed it into the hopper, and people started reacting to it, and we got a new Chief of Staff in Howard Baker in the spring, and we slowly started building back up. So I don't discount the importance of the president needing to get his numbers up to be able to function, because the Republicans in Congress can easily break and run. I was very concerned late last fall that it was going to be each man for himself. And in fact, I know it was. I was talking to senators and congressmen who were actively calculating whether they needed to start distancing themselves from the president. They got to get reelected, and I want them to get reelected. I don't want to see conservative Republican congressmen and senators lose elections because they have sort of dutifully stood by a president who is hurting them, so politically. So those kind of decisions get made by congressmen, and the president's advisors understand that they're making their decisions. And if the Republican members of Congress start breaking from the president, he can't get anything done. And so you start advising him, let's not press on this issue quite so much. Let's pull back just a few syllables on that. And that's the way you get ground down in this town and in this business. For the best of reasons, from your best and smartest advisors, they start giving you advice to be a bit more careful, to try to husband what support you have, to slowly build a little bit back. And that's all smart at a tactical level. The danger is that you miss strategic opportunities, and that's the balance, and that's, the politicians of genius are the ones who figure out the balance right, and the rest of us can analyze the balance after the fact. I'm always impressed by what Dr. Henry Kissinger said about the difference between historians and statesmen. He said, historians have the luxury of knowing all the facts and having all the time to analyze them, while statesmen have to act without enough information, without enough time. And either they get it right or wrong in the play of events. And we see this today, making decisions on what to do on Iran without knowing the facts, without knowing the full consequences of what you do, and yet you've got to decide. And inaction is his own decision. So it's a remarkably challenging task, and so far Bush has done a pretty good job. It's interesting that to a large extent, people said, well, he doesn't have a domestic agenda. He's accomplished so much of it. Whether it's in education, some of us have our disputes with No Child Left Behind, but nonetheless, he enacted that legislation. I supported the prescription drug proposal. A lot of conservatives didn't, but he got that passed. He got the big tax cuts passed. He's actually accomplished quite a lot of what he came to do domestically, but of course he's going to be defined and should be defined by his success in protecting our national security, and that's the zone for which there's tremendous vulnerability. I decided I didn't feel like sniping at the president in my column over nitpicking things like I mentioned to you. So I decided instead to discuss the state of the Democratic Party rather than the state of the Union. And that was a lot more fun to write last night. I will stop in a couple of minutes so we can do Q&As. I was stunned by the ineptness of the Democrats in their coordinated applause for the proposition that Social Security reform didn't get passed. I don't think that Tip O'Neill's Democrats of 20 years ago would have had the instinct to be seen by the public, 40 million people watching, to be cheering the failure to protect Social Security. I mean, Social Security is the sacred virgin of the Democratic Party. It's the single most iconic issue the Democrats have had, probably in their entire career, and certainly in the last 100 years. They have passed it. They have beaten Republicans for generations on the allegation that Republicans didn't support it, and for them to even sarcastically and even tactically be seen to be cheering the failure to fund it when it's a $4 trillion unfunded liability, and if we don't take action fairly soon, the boomers, when they retire, will only get about 72 cents on the dollar of benefits promised them. And for them to be taking that stand struck me as a party that has lost its instincts for competition. And I've sort of had the feeling that the best thing the Republicans have going for them in this election cycle is the Democrats. I regret to say that the best thing the Democrats have going for them in this cycle is the Republicans. I will just very briefly summarize a point, and then we'll go to Q&A. I was obviously involved pretty closely with Newt in the campaign to take back the House in '94, and a lot of people are comparing the Democrats' chances today with our chances then. And I think there are some comparisons and there are some differences. Regretfully, one of the comparisons is I think the Democrats have the charge of a culture of corruption issue if nothing else happens. If I were a Democratic operative right now, I'd want to put a lobster bib on because I'd be drooling at the opportunity to take shots at a party that has the public record that Republicans unfortunately already have, whether it's Duke Cunningham, whether it's the indictment, even though not conviction, of Tom DeLay, whether it's the SEC investigation, though no finding of responsibility by Frisk. But we're talking about politics, practical politics. These are things that practical politicians can use. We use them when the other side gets indicted. Trust me, and many of you in this room probably have carried that out. So-and-so was indicted. We don't wait for the conviction. We rally the point he was indicted. It's unfair, but that's politics. They're going to do the same thing to Republicans. Obviously they're going to. So they've got that issue. We had Hillary Care, which was a big national negative coming out of the White House in '94, and the general atmospherics of Clinton's conduct. The Democrats right now, if current trends continue, have a fair negative national atmospherics coming out of the Iraq War. I hope things will get better. They may get better, but currently I would think that the Iraq War is not a net plus for the Republicans nationally. There's some similarity there. Where they differ is that they have no capacity to have a positive message. We had the contract with America, 10 items. Now, any party can come up with a list of items. That's the easiest thing in the world. What made the contract with America useful was there were 10 issues that strongly motivated and activated our base and was quite appealing to 65 to 70% of the American public, the general public. These were just classic Reaganite issues. I mean, we didn't have to invent anything. We just had to sort through all the many issues that Reagan had stood for and found the 10 best. And so we were able to both motivate our base and have on the front page of every paper in the country on the day after we announced the contract a box with the 10 items that we would get done if we got elected. And they were items that 65 to 70% of the public liked seeing. Now, that had two advantages. One, it gave us something positive to say in a very negative environment. And two, it assisted our candidates, many of them inexperienced, state legislators or less, to be part of a team communicating a positive message, having the talking points, the substance, the whole package to deliver. They could stand up and deliver a very positive speech as an inexperienced challenger to a Democratic incumbent with a national media wraparound that we created for them, with the local reporters primed to talk on a topic that they were now primed by us to be able to talk about. So it was a wonderful management device and campaign device, as well as being a positive and serious agenda. The Democrats can't do that because right now their left is not positioned in the country the way the conservatives were positioned in the 90s. By the time we were into the mid-90s, conservatism was centrist. To be a conservative was to be mainstream, and is still. 34% of the public is self-identified conservatives, only 19% are self-identified liberals. So if you took the 10 issues that really inspired the MoveOn.org crowd, there's not an issue there that would be appealing to 60% of the American public. It would be appealing to about 25% of the American public, the hardcore activist left. And so they can't come up simultaneously with the same issues to motivate their base and reach out to their marginal voters. So I don't think they have that capacity. They don't have the element of surprise. We came up on the Democrats by surprise because no one thought there was any chance of them losing. So a lot of incumbent Democrats who thought they were safe because they'd won by 62% or 58% and had been elected 8 times, found out that in fact there was a stealth campaign that was credible, and they hadn't been going home, they hadn't been campaigning, they hadn't raised enough money to protect themselves, and we knocked them off. We picked up 52 seats. Republicans know that they're under the gun, and it's going to be a particularly dull-witted Republican congressman or senator who is not going to spend most of their time going home every weekend campaigning, raising maximum money. So the element of surprise is lost. And I think we had a tremendous financial advantage because we ran candidates in every district in the country. It's the only time that we've ever done it as a party. We ran Nethercutt against Speaker Foley, not because we expected to beat him. That was an added bonus, but because we knew that Foley would then raise $5 million and spend it on himself. And if he didn't do that, if he didn't have a candidate against him, he'd raise $5 million and pass it to the other Democrats who needed it. So he, in fact, raised the $5 million, spent it on himself, happened to lose. And as a result, we almost wiped out the Washington State Democratic congressional delegation. The Democrats, it's too late for them to be able to implement that. They don't have the infrastructure or the candidates or the money to do that. So I go into this election cycle very wary. I think it's the most vulnerable moment for the Republican majority in the House since 96. Newt always thought that 96 and 98 were the 2 test years, and if we could get past them, we'd be good for the indefinite future. He was right, but this is now getting close to the indefinite future viewed from way back then. And it's going to be a hard-fought campaign. And if you have any relationship with any incumbent or Republican challenger, I encourage you to do everything you can, because on election night we'll probably be looking well into the night to see how certain votes are going. I mean, it would not surprise me at all to see the majority come down to 4, 5, 6 particularly competitive seats. I would say now we have about this is over-quantifying, but I would say about a 60% chance of holding the House. One last observation as to one of the problems, it just dawned on me last Thursday evening. I just share it with you, and then we'll go on to questions. The problem the Republicans are going to have passing a budget resolution, this may sound boring, but House Republicans want to have as tough a deficit-cutting budget as possible because Republicans want to motivate the base to come out and vote. This is going to be, I think, largely a base turnout election. In 1994, we got 5% more Republicans coming out to vote than we normally did, and that was all the difference in all the marginal seats. We need to get Republicans strongly motivated to come out and vote on this election. So, conservatives have been frustrated with the lack of spending restraint. They'll be strongly motivated to do that. But in the Senate, and they also want tax cuts in the House. In the Senate, by chance, in the 6 most important elections that the Republicans have, either where they have an opportunity, as in Maryland, or where they're on the defense, as in Pennsylvania, None of them are red states. They're all either blue, purple, or toss-up states. And therefore, Republican senators are going to be very nervous to take the spending cut negative that comes with trying to reduce the deficit. They're not going to want to defend a cut in Medicaid spending. And they're probably going to see that they don't want to have to go back to Pennsylvania and Missouri and Ohio and other states can be very close and have to explain why they voted for reductions in programs that will be popular. So you have this disparity in electoral calculation between the two houses amongst Republicans, which way to go on spending cuts. And it'll be interesting to see how they resolve that. The best prediction is we won't have a budget resolution this year. But if we don't have a budget resolution, then you can't have something called reconciliation, which allows you to pass taxes and other entitlement provisions with 51 votes in the Senate. Then you need 60 votes in the Senate. So I would look to see not much get done in Congress this year because the Republicans are not going to be really in as much sync as they want to for fundamental reasons. Not a question of incompetence. They just have different challenges in the House and Senate looking out to the election, and because obviously the Democrats will try to do to them, the Republicans, what we tried to do to the Democrats in '94, make every one of their proposals, a target on a legislative killing field. That's rationally what the Democrats should do this season. They're going to do it. Republicans are not going to be overly united legislatively. So it's going to be a slog, a tough campaign season for conservative principles, but I'm modestly hopeful that at the end of the cycle we're going to have a Republican Congress and 2 more years for President Bush to lead them without another election in between, and we can still accomplish a fair amount. Certainly I feel blessed to be in a country where our president is both honorable and understands national security and is willing to take stands to protect us. Without that, we would be distraught. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Tony, I'm really concerned that if we lose the House, that the Democrats will come through with an impeachment against the president.
I actually suggested in my column that will come out tomorrow that Republicans should play up the Democratic call for President Bush's impeachment. I think Republicans should tell the public, do you really, if you elect your Democrat to Congress, we're going to face the last 2 years of the Bush presidency with the Congress trying to impeach him during wartime. And I don't believe, I haven't seen any polls on it, but I can't believe that much more than 1 in 10 Americans want to see this president impeached. Even a pretty hardcore presidential opponents think that's nuts. Nonetheless, the Democratic Party is acting sufficiently nuts that I think that I want to give lots of publicity to the Democrats' call for impeachment because I think that'll be a great campaign issue. Yes, sir.
Tony, I was at a luncheon when Newt Gingrich was talking about what seemed to me like a new contract for America. Are you familiar with what he's going for? If you want to say the word about it?
I'm only. Oh, the question was. Newt apparently has come out with a new contract with America. Am I familiar with it, and could I talk about it? Not really, so no. I talk to Newt about every 6 weeks. We're great friends, but I haven't followed his particular items, so I probably know less about it than some people in the room. Yes, sir.
Given the aura of corruption in the House, and that you have 3 candidates for majority speaker,
Majority leader. Yeah.
Is there any of these 3 candidates that you think would be most successful in changing this aura?
I think it's going to be very hard. The question is, of the 3 candidates running for majority leader, a decision will be made presumably tomorrow night amongst the Republican caucus in the House. Do I see anyone who is best positioned to reduce the aura of corruption? I mean, I think this is pretty much baked in the cake, to be honest. I think the public's got that impression. Whoever wins is going to try to have some sort of reform package. I'm not in this instance, but I'm against the gifts. When Newt came in, we passed a gift rule that Newt insisted on, that you just can't have all these personal gifts. There was an exception created that was for charitable deduction, and then in subsequent years the exception swallowed the rule. But the idea that a congressman or a staffer should get a $5,000 golf vacation from a lobbyist is nuts. And I'm sorry if that upsets the lifestyles of some of our friends, but that is simply too conspicuously suggestive to be justified. So I think they'll all try to do something. They all have to have, look, this upcoming election on both sides of the aisle is not going to be a money-free event. I mean, the Democrats are going to raise every penny they can. The Republicans are going to continue to raise every penny they can. And the leaders of each of those parties have to have a relationship with K Street. I mean, that's simply the reality. It's not going to change between now. If a party that decides not to raise money on K Street is going to lose, despite the issue, because the American public generally thinks that both parties are corrupt. I mean, one of the great conceits of the two parties is we each think that we are perceived as distinctly more honorable than the other party, and when you travel around the country, you find out whether you're talking to a Republican or a Democrat in Ohio or Idaho or California, they think that both parties are fundamentally corrupt. They just happen to like us a little better because of our ideas or whatever it is. And so I don't think it's going to make a lot of difference. I'd go for, if I were voting, I'd go for the person who I thought could be the most effective leader, the most effective legislator. It's going to be a very, very tough season. But they're all good, I mean, the truth is, ideologically, they're all good, solid conservatives. I mean, you can pick and choose. We did an editorial where I had my writer call each of the three candidates and say, could you point out a couple of issues, votes that you've had that you're particularly proud of, perhaps in contrast with your opposition? And we ran it. It was a straight thing. We didn't chart it up with adjectives or adverbs, just so that each of them cite the examples. And, you know, on one issue they differed with one a little bit, on another one they agreed.